Hello and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be talking about a bunch of lesbian books that I would recommend. Please ignore the fact that my nail has fallen off on my pointer finger and that these are incredibly grown out. Let's all ignore that and just get talking about some lesbian books. So basically I'm going to go through this stack that I have here. Most of this is, I would consider, literary, but within kind of some subgenres. You'll see what I mean when I get into it. I think the first few books are going to be classics, then some contemporary literary realism stuff, and then some more magical realism literary stuff, and then some weird stuff like short story collections, a little bit speculative maybe, and yeah, so let's just get into it. So the first book I want to talk about that is a lesbian classic is Passing by Nella Larsen. This book really deals with lesbianism in a subtextual way, but it's very important in how it does that, because it's a seminal Harlem Renaissance novel. It's very short, and it's about two women who both can pass. Basically, during this time, there are groups of people or individuals who are Black and grew up in Black communities but have decided to exit it and pass as white because they are light. And one woman, she's firmly entrenched in this sort of upper middle class established Harlem Black community, and she's married to this man, has children. And this other woman who comes into her life is someone who has passed the color line. Basically, we see their fraught relationship, and it is somewhat tragic and almost a bit comic at points. It's very beautifully written. It is a classic for a reason, and it's really a important text in understanding lesbian subtext and sapphic underpinnings and writing in what it looked like in the 20th century, and really crucial. I am talking about a lot of different types of lesbian books today. A lot of them, I would say, aren't necessarily explicitly lesbian, I guess, or explicitly lesbian, but they are fundamentally lesbian texts that deal with lesbian themes of lesbian desire, if not lesbian identity, and moments of defining lesbian relationships that really shape these characters and their choices and who they are and the themes of the novel. If it's not, about a lesbian or whatever, it's more about what's happening in the text, I suppose. See, now that I actually said that, I had to add some more books onto this stack. Next classic, Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf. This is really a classic in the way that it plays with form, the way that it is a seminal modernist text. The inner world of women, as well as the external world that they live in, as we follow this one woman, Mrs. Dalloway's life in a single day. It's a snapshot in preparation for a party in the evening, her relationship with her child and her husband and her past and people in the community around her, and the effects of World War I. But it's a seminal lesbian text for a reason, and there's a lot of sort of dense language and prose that really speaks to the present of this time. Another modernist lesbian book, Nightwood by Juna Barnes. This book really speaks to lesbian yearning and longing for a figure that is free and wild and crazy in this way that cannot be contained. And again, it is in the early 20th century-ish. We also are following characters in a weird form. There's a lot of moving through perspectives and trying to understand what actually is going on, but it's part of working through the prose and the joy of it and understanding our main character's desire for Robin, the love interest type character, and her dynamic with the men in their lives, the ways that everyone is faking their way through society, and it's pretty compelling. So yeah. Another lesbian classic is the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas by Gertrude Stein. This book was written by Gertrude Stein, obviously, but it's an autobiography of her wife, her lifelong partner, Alice B. Toklas. Gertrude Stein is someone who is a really interesting figure. She had a really big ego and she wrote in a way that was like what Picasso was to art was her with writing and prose, poetry, plays. And this book is probably her most readable published text in terms of, the sentences making grammatical, like logical sense. But of course, she's writing in the voice of her lover. So it sort of queers the textual form in that way. It speaks to the experiences that they had together, their lives together in the Paris art world in like the early 1930s-ish or 1920s, how they came up together, how they met each other, how they lived their lives together. And people of the time, contemporaries of their time, did comment on how, people who knew them personally was like, wow, this really does sound like Alice B. Toklas's voice. But of course, Gertrude Stein was writing it, so it sort of speaks of the intimacy that these women had with each other. And actually, Hemingway was she kind of mentored him a bit, but then he ended up being kind of homophobic towards her and disliking her later. But she is very much, Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein are very much a prototypical femme butch couple before these terms were necessarily in use, and they're iconic in the lesbian literary scenes, in the lesbian art scenes, in lesbian history for the things that they contributed to like mainstream art. Like there would be no Matisse or Picasso or Hemingway without her, and her Rue 14, I think, her Paris studio salon that she owned. So very complicated historical figures. That is something that this book gives us, that sort of first person perspective into their lives and what they thought and who they communicated with. It's really interesting. And then we have another classic. This is a lesbian feminist 70s classic, Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. What a romp. We just follow this girl who is headstrong and so self-assured and bold and kind of obnoxious as she traverses from southern buttfuck nowhere type community to the big city and her various lesbian dalliances across the way and all the dumbasses she runs into, her encountering sort of queer culture and queer life for the first time, her just trying to survive as this working class kid who's coming into different emerging feminist and civil rights movements. It's very much a sort of auto-fictional biography of Rita Mae Brown, who's a complicated, interesting figure as well. She helped start the Lavender Menace, the lesbian feminist organization movement of the 70s. And yeah, Ruby Fruit Jungle, this is really fun and very readable and very vivid. Like all the different like problematic takes she has, all the hilarity and tragedy of her life is articulated through this novel in a really fun, fast-paced way. And then of course we have The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. This is what Carol, the movie, is based on, and the book is much more, I think, in some ways tragic and somewhat not even imbued with the desire. And we're following a young girl, Therese, who's like 19, and then Carol, who's a married older woman with a child, obviously. And the way that their dynamic plays out in like the 50s. It's a cult classic for a reason. I think that more people should read the book. Highsmith as a historical figure is also really weird and interesting, and this book as a glimpse into the McCarthyist homophobic world of the mid-20th century America and the various entanglements that both these women have with the men that they are involved with or potentially involved with is portrayed in a way that I think the text treats really interestingly, and the adaptation is of course what it is in the film, but the book is pretty interesting as well, so I think you should check it out if you like the movie. And now moving on to contemporary lesbian novels. Of course, I have to talk about Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This book Each chapter basically follows a different girl, woman, or other, and there are quite a few queer perspectives that we take on in this book, and it's all of these Black British women and girls and others as they find out and understand their places in the world and their roles, who they are. We see their lives, we see glimpses of their lives, we see some of the span of their lives and the ways that these people are connected with each other and not. It's really compelling. It won the Booker Prize in 2019, obviously, and I read this, I think in 2018, 2020. I think I read this in 2020. So it was a long time ago at this point, but it was really compelling while I was reading it. It was so compulsively readable, so kind of like fast paced in like a literary way, and each person that we were in the perspective of was really compelling and like interesting as a character to follow. I thought it was really good, and I think all the different lesbian themes and details that are just all throughout this book are all really just satisfying in how almost true to life some of these portrayals feel. So yeah, pick this up if you haven't already. I really liked it. And now to get into some books where the main characters are explicitly not lesbians, but that a lesbian subplot or lesbianism or lesbian relationship is kind of crucial to the text, I would have to say The Very Nice Box by Laura Blackett and Eve Gleichman. I talked about this as one of my favorite books of like last year or maybe the year before that. I forgot. No, I think last year, like 2023. And it's just so like, it's ostensibly about the relationship between Matt and, oh my gosh, the main character, Ava. Because Matt is the new boss at the company that Ava works at as like a sort of design engineer person for furniture and organizational boxes. An IKEA type, like a high-end IKEA type organization, and it's ostensibly about their relationship. But really, our main character, Ava, her bisexuality, her attraction to women, her experiences with women, past, present, future, are really, I think, crucial in defining her, because she, as a person, is so regimented and lives life in very rules that she has constructed for herself to abide by. And it's really interesting because it's a trauma response. We get to see the whole situation surrounding it. I don't want to spoil anything, but she is like the only other like LGBT person alongside her best work friend, whom she talks about, I think, reality television with. And they do talk about being sort of the token minorities at their workplace, which is obviously very corporate and white and hetero, especially with Matt being the new CEO of the company. It's really fascinating, and lesbian dynamics in here are really important to our main character and her identity. But obviously the main relationship of this novel is not really about that. It's about some other very interesting things, and it's like super fast paced, super readable, and very compelling. All right, now we have another book that is a favorite of all time, a book that I read a few years ago at this point and talked about on the podcast. We actually interviewed the author Ellie Eaton for the podcast, and that is The Divines. This book is a boarding school book, but it sort of alternates between the 90s and present day. In present day, our main character is married to this man. They move to the US together. They have a daughter or something. But we see the process of that, like her being in this relationship, becoming a mother, and the way that she's still stuck in her past in a lot of ways. Hence, the chapters alternating between past and present. And in the past, the sort of queer girlhood intimacy and like toxicity of this all-girls British boarding school environment is really, really compelling, really interesting. You can, if you note down how many times I say compelling or interesting in this video, don't. But anyways, essentially the ways that gender operates within that world, this very contained world where how class operates, all these posh British girls and then the sort of townies. And there is one relationship between our main character and the town and a townie that is really, has lesbian themes, and is very homoerotic. I mean, the whole school environment is pretty homoerotic. The way that she feels so out of place with these other girls, and then the way that memory and reality shape each other and play off of each other in this book brings things to a really, really kind of climactic ending that isn't climactic at all. It's interesting. So, yeah, I would consider this a lesbian novel because I think that the lesbian themes to it, despite our main character obviously being in a hetero relationship at the end of the novel, not necessarily defining her sexuality at any point, it's evident in the all girls boarding school environment and her fixation on these girls, these women. So, the next book I want to talk about is similarly queer, but not necessarily about a lesbian or anything, which is Schmutz by Felicia Berliner. This book is so interesting. It's about this 18-year-old Hasidic girl who is addicted to porn because she like attends community college or something for an accounting program or degree, and her really conservative Jewish community is kind of constraining, well, very much so, especially in regards to gender, in her freedom of movement, what she's able to do with her life, and in that way, her porn addiction. Like, she just can't stop watching porn, all types of different kinds of porn in like her room with this, laptop that the school basically gave her. It's like old and junky, and she has all this like repressed desire and has no conception really of interacting with the world outside of her Orthodox community that she has grown up in and sort of stayed in. But we see her as she sort of challenges those religious and community and social boundaries and mores that have been enforced and imposed onto her since she was young, and while also honoring that part of her identity and her selfhood and trying to understand how she can get what she wants and also stay true to herself. But it's much more funny and lively than that, and there is a sort of lesbian interaction or relationship towards the end of the book that I think is also kind of crucial to her development and in shaping who she is as a person. So this is one of my favorite books of a couple years ago, I think, and I would still recommend it. The next book is a book that is very explicitly lesbian. Our main character says that she's a lesbian, and it's a crucial plot point to the story, and that is Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. This book is one of my favorites from 2021, I think. I loved it a lot, but I get why people might not, and I just recently finished Emily Austen's second book, which is also about a lesbian and kind of has similar themes. But basically in this book, our main character has a lot of anxiety and a crushing sense of an inability to like deal with a lot of things. She's super depressed. She doesn't know that she is. Also, she can't really conceive of that. She is living in her own little bubble. She forces herself to get this job that is being secretary for like a Catholic church, but it's because she randomly shows up to go to group counseling or something because she saw like a flyer advertising it. But then when she gets there, the priest or the pastor or whatever is like, oh, so you're here for the secretary interview? Cool. The previous secretary who had been working there was this old woman who had died. So she takes over her role and then ends up emailing back this other old woman who was communicating with the previous secretary over email. And she just is so caught up in social anxiety and fear that she's like, what do I do? I guess I'm just going to impersonate this old woman and email her back. And that sets off a chain of events. She also is closeted to her workplace. Obviously, it's a Catholic church. She just has to like lie and dodge around being a lesbian. And a lot of this is really funny. A lot of this also resonates deeply with, lesbians who are probably autistic, probably just very definitely deeply anxious and depressed in this way that I think was really compelling. Like the mental illness aspect felt very immersive, like you could feel her anxieties, I guess. And yeah, I like this as a sort of lesbian contemporary novel. And then another LGBT classic of a book, but I think it's too recently published for me to have considered it like a proper classic, because those books were all published in like the 1970s or prior. This book was published, I think, in the early 2000s-ish. This is Nevada by Imogen Binney. This book is a seminal text for trans literature, media about trans women, I guess. I mean, our main character in this book is this trans woman who works at a bookstore, I think, and lives in New York. She has a trans girlfriend as well. So that's the lesbian relationship. But it kind of falls apart. She decides to leave and move and go to Nevada, in which she encounters this person who is definitely a closeted trans woman. But basically, this book follows this character as she goes through these things, but then the second half of the book is from the other character's perspective as he is experiencing her entrance into his life, and things get shaken up. Like, this book is really crucial to the LGBT literary canon, I would argue, and I think is just true. Really, the two women in this book, Maria and Steph, I think the first scene is them having sex and it not really going well, and then we see their relationship as it's like not working out. I think it's funny in some points and also really sad in how it discusses, you know, being a trans woman, being queer. And sorry, my camera cut out, so if we've shifted, please don't mind that. Yeah, basically, you know, we're seeing this landscape of America in this really compelling way that feels very vivid as well. This is a really good lesbian book. So next, I have another more subtextual, perhaps, lesbian book, and that is Eileen by Otessa Moshfegh. Eileen is about a woman named Rebecca who is obsessed with this woman named Eileen, and shit gets weird. It's set in like 1960s Christmas season. I know a movie just came out of this book, like an adaptation. I started it, I haven't finished it, I need to finish it. But this book is very neurotic lesbian in its conception and in the course of what happens in this book. Like, our main character is constantly fantasizing about this boy, this dude who works at the juvenile detention center that she works at, but she like keeps on being like, oh, but he's probably gay, but he's probably gay. And then in comes this woman with like a degree from Harvard who is like, oh, I gotta do some reform at this school, and then she becomes instantly obsessed with her, like wants her so bad, but isn't necessarily. She's so self-critical, she's so obsessed with hating herself and finding herself disgusting, and many parts of her world and her life are pretty disgusting, but she's so concerned with that she is deeply repressed in every way, especially in her sexuality, in a way that is kind of hilarious and makes for a really interesting book about obsession, desire, and crazy mid-century bullshit. So would pick this up if that sounds interesting to you and you haven't read it already. Another book about like crazy women doing crazy things and being obsessed with each other, or one woman being obsessed with another woman, would be Sedating Elaine by Dawn Winter. This book was crazy, okay? This book was insane, and it's about these two women who live together in this flat in London, but the main character is this woman who like is kind of addicted to drugs, I'm pretty sure. At least like she has extreme debt with this drug dealer. She's a dishwasher full time. And then she gets involved with this woman named Elaine, who is her girlfriend, who's like super active, always wanting to have sex, like running around all the time. And Elaine is obsessed with our main character. What's our main character's name? Frances. Yeah, Elaine is obsessed with Frances in this way that is overwhelming for Frances, because Frances isn't obsessed with her. Like, not really. She kind of finds her to be a major nuisance. Hence, she wants to sedate her girlfriend. The reason why they're really together is because Elaine is pretty rich, like generational wealth type money, and so she gets to like live there like rent free, and she just has to put up with her for that. And also she's still reeling from the heartbreak of this woman that she's still obsessed with named Adrienne. Yes, Adrienne. So basically Frances is still obsessed with Adrienne, but now she's with Elaine. All these women I think are bisexual. Yeah, all of them are. They just happen to be in this weird entanglement with each other, and Frances runs into Adrienne weirdly. Adrienne and Frances met very randomly and weirdly. Frances and Elaine met very randomly and weirdly, and they just sort of immediately start living together and like doing everything together. You know, very lesbian in that way. And this book is ultimately about the way that a really weird, toxic lesbian relationship goes sideways, facing a lot of pressure at the very beginning and throughout the dynamic, as Frances has no choice but to sedate Elaine to like get her off her ass so she can like collect herself for a minute and figure out how she's going to pay back her drug dealer debts and before they come to her apartment and beat her up. Very, very funny. All right, and now we have more of a proper romance. Yerba Buena by Nina LaCour. Very, very compelling lesbian romance type novel. It's more lit-fic, I would say. I mean, these two women encounter each other about halfway through the book. We see their dynamics with other people before we even get to that point, and it's really about the sort of trauma and social dynamics and comings of age that has shaped both of these women, and the way that we follow it is so compelling and interesting, and their families that produced these people as who they are, and then the way that they encounter each other kind of in the restaurant industry as they both get into it from different angles a little bit. And really one of them is like a florist, the other is a bartender type person. It's very sweet and kind of just heart-wrenching and touching in a lot of ways, but just really beautiful. And it's about their lesbian relationship and of course their queerness and their experiences and traumas outside of it, but the way that they come together and help heal each other in some ways is really wholesome and again heartwarming. So I really enjoyed this. I think this is one of my favorite reads of 2022. So yeah, are we seeing a theme here? A lot of fave reads in these recommendations. And now we have a favorite read of 2023, which is Black Wave by Michelle T. Now we're getting into the weirder stuff. This is a novel that kind of has some magical realism elements to it, but more so it plays with form in this way. This meta-narrative thing, like kind of halfway through the novel, that is so interesting. It's a big blend of Michelle T's like own experiences in her own life and of course fiction, and it's about this woman who is in denial about being an alcoholic in a very funny way. Like the whole book is written so hilariously, it's so sharp, it's so smart, it's so just on it. The dialogue is just impeccable. These characters feel so real. They feel like real life lesbians that you would run into on the streets of San Francisco in like the 90s. And the house that she describes living in, the writer jobs she has, the stupid bullshit that gets gotten up to, the way she moves from San Francisco. She has these lesbian moms and a gay brother. And the way that she is just trying to scrape by and survive, and it's not doing that so well. She is an alcoholic in massive denial, in major denial, but she's gonna get through it, basically. That's what this book is about, and it's really, really good. It's so good. It's so funny. It's so lesbian, and I love it. And here we have Saltfish Girl by Larissa Lai. This book kind of alternates between a robotic science fiction future and a distant, ancient, mythological past from this Chinese diasporic perspective between two girls who are kind of in love with each other across these times. It plays with time and space and womanhood and imperialism and cyber orientalism in this way that is really, really interesting and smart. The girls who get together in this, it's crucial not only to the dynamics at hand with these characters, but also to the construction of this world and the narrative surrounding it. How one timeline set in 1046 BC ends up connecting with a storyline that is set in 2044 in Serendipity, a walled city on the west coast of North America, versus the bank of the Yellow River, pre-Shang Dynasty. Like, yeah, so it's pretty sick, it's pretty cool, pretty awesome. It's very imaginative and very lesbian. Now we have another sort of magical realism, but more literary book called Butter, Honey, Pig, Bread by Francesca Equiasi. This book, it is magical realism-ish in the way that it is ultimately rooted in mythology. It's about these two sisters, and one of whom believes she is a Ogbonje, I'm not pronouncing that right, but which is a spirit that plagues the family with grief by dying repeatedly in childhood and being reborn. One of these sisters believes she is this, and her twin sister is tied up with that fate, of course. And then their mother, who raised them, obviously, like these three women, we follow their perspectives, but mostly the sisters, if I remember correctly. And one of the sisters is very queer. She is in this sort of rotating cast of lesbian relationships. They have both suffered a lot of family trauma and life experiences jointly, and they don't encounter each other again after being separated for a while until when they all come back home for this thing, and they're kind of awkwardly around each other in the kitchen. I think one of them is a chef. It's really interesting, and I think the lesbian subplot of one of these, like the lesbianism or the queerness of one of the women who in her timeline, one of the sisters in her timeline, and that kind of almost subplot is really, really interesting and builds a fullness and richness to this novel. Everything that happens in here is really realistic in a way, even when, and it feels grounded and rooted in reality. So yeah, I think I read this during a reading vlog a couple years ago or a year ago or something. I'll link it in the cards if you're interested. And now we have some proper science fiction fantasy, but it's kind of set in the real world. Basically, I have Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. I actually did a makeup look based on this book, if you remember. I put it on my Instagram like a long time ago. Anyways, this book is about a violin teacher who is this older woman who's bound to the devil. Like, she has to sacrifice 6 or 7 students in order for her to be free from her curse. She falls in love with this donut shop owner woman. Also, she takes in this homeless trans girl who's kind of a violin prodigy under her wing. And we see all these things play out across the landscape of, I think, LA or something? San Gabriel Valley. Yeah, so basically the relationship between the donut shop owner, who actually is an alien, and this woman who is cursed and bound to the devil. This dynamic is like, oh, can love break our curse or whatever? It's really interesting. It's really fun, but it's also, again, like, it's serious. It deals with the things, it follows these experiences of being a homeless trans girl, of these more older women in these kind of fantastical situations who end up getting this other main character caught up in it. And it's really sweet in a lot of ways. So another lesbian book to recommend. Now I have a kind of more dark, magical lesbian book, and that is Siren Queen by Nevo. This is set in a sort of magical realism reconfiguration of old Hollywood, the golden age of Hollywood, in which we follow this Chinese American girl who dances onto the set as an extra, kind of convinces her parents to let her do it, and then she gets caught up in a deal with kind of the devil. Like, basically it's the wolf. Like, there's something almost anthropomorphic or anthropomorphized magical versions of how the Hollywood studio system back then had become sort of metaphorized. Is that a word? It becomes a metaphor basically in this book that is literalized. through these magical creatures and selling your soul and signing contracts with the devil, etc. But not actually the devil, like the studios that are the wolf or whatever. And our main character brought into these roles obviously as like a Chinese American girl from the early 20th century America. It's like in early 20th century Hollywood, it's like, you know, she has to deal with a lot of bullshit, but she also is a lesbian and she has to deal with a lot of things from the industry and from within that lens and experience and standpoint. Because of being a lesbian, she ends up being in like sort of a lavender marriage situation or like a bearding relationship. She ends up having to navigate not only the racial and gender dynamics of this world, but also the sexual politics of it. It's written in this very beautiful, gorgeous, magically rendered way with a lot of like prose that is steeped in the world of like fantasy while also feeling so real in psychologically and emotionally real, I guess. And I also did a book cover recreation of this book, if you remember from my Instagram. Now we finally have our last 3 books on this rec list. Actually, no, I'm now seeing on my bookshelf in front of me a couple more. Let me go get those. Here is a very short fantasy, sort of retelling, a tongue-in-cheek retelling of the Sleeping Beauty story that deals with chronic terminal illness, and it has these very gorgeous sort of ink illustrations throughout. It's a Sleeping Beauty retelling, and our main character is a lesbian. She gets transported to the fairy tale kingdoms. She studies fairy tales and folklore academically, and she knows that she's going to die in the near future because of her very rare illness that is somewhat associated with and metaphorically, I don't think it actually exists in our reality, but is in touch with the Sleeping Beauty Rose story. Pretty funny. It's very much a fairy tale retelling, and our main character, she has some sass, she has some bite, she has kind of a goth best friend too, and this is a series. Like, it follows her as she sort of enters through this tower as like a magical portal into other universes. It's fun. I had a fun time with it. And actually, before I get into the short stories, there is a lit-fic book that I forgot to talk about that is about lesbian obsession and desire. Pizza Girl by Jane Kyung Fraser. This pregnant teenage girl who lives with her boyfriend and her mom becomes obsessed with this middle-aged housewife mother whom she delivers pizzas to, and we see that lesbian desire fuel dynamic age gap thing evident in this book, in this narrative, and it's very much a sad lit-fic sad girl novel type situation, but our main character is half Korean, half white. Her dad recently died being an alcoholic, and so she's suffering through a lot of things, and part of that has been channeled through her obsession with this woman. So it's really interesting, and I read it a while ago, but I did like it. And now to move on to the kind of weird lesbian short story collections. So here we have How to Wrestle a Girl by Vanita Blackburn. These are short stories and vignettes and that play with form in a way that, and structure that is like pretty innovative and interesting. I did a reading vlog where I read this, and there are lesbian elements in some of these short stories. Other ones are not about that at all. But our writer is I think is a clear black woman, and it comes through in the way that these stories are like feminist and angry and queer and black in a way that is really beautiful and very smart. Like the way that gender is explored here, the way that these different short stories feel like little snippets of something just strange, but also like really interesting and itches your mind, scratches your mind in a way that like a more ordinary, I guess, short story collection or novel can't. So kind of esoteric in that way, or esoteric. How do you say that? Yeah. enjoyed it. Pick it up if you like weird, queer black girl fiction and short stories. A lot of the short stories are like really short as well. And now, a favorite read of last year, Things to Do When You're Goth in the Country and Other Stories by Shavisa Woods. So interesting, so queer, lots of lesbians and lesbian desire and homoerotic relationships evident in this short story collection. It's kind of what you get on in the title of the short story collection, and the titular story is what you get, you know? It's about weirdos who are from the country and dealing with religious guilt from being in the South, growing up in that environment, and also queer identity in the midst of something really weird and crazy happening, girlhood, returning to your hometown, in this way that is so smart, so interesting, so funny in some ways, but also fundamentally, like, original. Just original in a way that I haven't been able to find again since reading this. Like, the different concepts even in these stories, just nothing like it, I think. Okay, now I have Gods of Want by K. Ming Chang. This is a very kind of dense and rich type of language that deals with sort of Asian American queer womanhood in these stories that feel like they all exist in the same world with the same people, but that are different and that are very bodily and gruesome in some ways, and the descriptions are just so rich, but fundamentally is very much imbued with lesbianism, lesbian desire, also being a daughter of immigrants, being a firstborn daughter, being a sister, being a girl, in this way that feels like raw and gritty and real, not romanticized, but also just sort of magical in the horrific elements of what is going on in these stories. A lot of family dynamics present here, uncles and aunts and moms and dads, and integration of Chinese culture and experiences, working class immigrant slices of life and dynamics, and sort of the grossness and comedy of it all. It's very smart, I think. And finally, I have a lesbian short story collection called Fruiting Bodies by Catherine Harlan. This short story collection is very gay, I would say. Like, the second to last story in here, which is the titular one, Fruiting Bodies, is about two women who live in the woods together, estranged from the rest of the world because one of them has an interesting condition. Another story in here is about trying to understand lesbian subtext, uncovering the lesbian identity of a historical long dead figure. A lot of these stories are very weird, very strange, very maybe off-putting, but really interesting. Like, my favorite stories in here are definitely Fruiting Bodies and then Fiddler Fool Pair. I actually wrote an essay about Fiddler Fool Pair, which is up on my podcast Substack if you want to check it out, but it's an essay you can only read if you've read the story. So I would just recommend you reading the book. There's the second story, Hunting the Viper King, is about this girl who lives in like a trailer park type situation with her dad, who has always been hunting after this mythical creature that's kind of like the Loch Ness but different. Its own thing, its own entity within this realm of cryptid hunters who are really dedicated to finding something that doesn't necessarily exist. And her life, her girlhood, growing up in that environment. There's also one called The Changeling about these two cousins, one of whom convinces the other one that their new baby sibling is a changeling through these fairy tales. It feels very fairy tale-esque in a lot of ways, and I think that again, a lot of original concepts here that I found compelling in how they were carried out, how they were done. I think elements of dialogue in here and the just psychological realism, again, of characters constructed, even in more absurd circumstances and worlds. It's very immersive, and I really, really liked it. Actually, I ran into someone at the lesbian bar the other day when I was visiting New York who told me that she liked this book a lot, and that she actually, I guess, found my channel, or maybe was Goodreads friends with me in noticing that we both really like this book, so if you're watching this, hi. But yeah, this is a solid short story collection if you're looking for something magical realism-y. Okay, those are all of my recommendations. I don't even know how many books I just talked about, but it certainly was a lot, I think. Let me know if you've read any of these and what your thoughts on them were, if you have, or which of these books you are most looking forward to picking up next, if you are going to. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that nothing I said was too, or nothing I recommended was like too repetitive. I know I've talked about all these in wrap-ups, obviously a lot of these in favorites videos in the past few years, and you know, I hope you still got something from it. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!